So last time we were together here, we began a new teaching series that we're calling This is Church. And we're taking some time to think about what makes church church. Okay, what are the kind of characteristics of the church that actually we believe, don't we? I think I'm preaching to the choir. We ultimately believe that church isn't a building or a particular place that we might go to. But church is people. It's an embodiment of people. The New Testament word is ecclesia, which literally means an assembly, a gathering of people. It's who we are. It's not something we do. Okay? Although we talk about doing church, actually church is who we are. It's not something that we do. And so we're spending our time leading up to the summer and leading up to our break in August, just thinking about what characterizes the church. And we're looking at 4 different things. But and I guess in some ways the subtext of that is us trying to say, well, if this is what characterizes the church from the scriptures and how we understand what church is, and I guess this is something of the kind of church that we want to be as well. And so last time, as I say, we looked at this idea of what it means to be a generous church. This week, we're going to look at what it means to be a worshipping church. Okay? John Wimber, who was the kind of founder of the kind of family of churches that we belong to, he said this about worship. He says, it's an act of freely giving love to God that forms and informs every activity of the Christian life. And so if something forms and informs every part of us, then I think by definition that becomes a priority. And simply a priority is something that we regularly engage in doing. It's something we routinely make space for in our lives. It's something that we give ourselves to regardless on a continued basis. Now, if you're not sure what your priorities are, if you're not sure what are the things that make it on the top of your list, then can I suggest you look at 2 things. You look at your diary and you look at your bank statements. Because generally, the things that we spend our time, our energy, and our money doing are the things that are most important to us. Not all the time, because I know we have to work, and sometimes work is not that important to us, is it? But actually, the things that we give ourselves to on a regular basis are often the things that we see as priorities in life. And our worship of God is meant to be a priority. And that priority is understood, I think, in 3 distinct ways. Firstly, it's our greatest commandment. It's our greatest commandment. Matthew 28:37, Jesus declares this as the greatest commandment, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. You and I are called to worship God with every part of our being. The Apostle Paul, he kind of echoes Jesus' words in Romans 12:1. He says, therefore, and I was always told if there's a therefore, you look what it's there for. But he says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And so the priority of worship, the importance of our worship affects every area of our lives. You know, the way we get up, the way we go to work, when we eat, when we drink, the way we drive our cars, the way we bring up our kids. It's all an expression of our worship. And I know you all know this, okay? But worship doesn't begin and end when we get up and sing for 25, 30 minutes on a Sunday morning. Worship here on a Sunday morning is really the sum of our worship that took place the other 6 days, yeah? It's the sum of all the worship that's gone on the rest of life. And I guess the challenge is how's worship gone this week? How's worship been this week? How has a life laid down before Christ gone this week? Is worship here on a Sunday the kind of natural overflow of where we've been the other 6 days? Or do we come on a Sunday morning and it's a little bit of an uphill struggle? You know, I need to drink at least 2 coffees before I can worship this morning, and at least 3.5 donuts. No, I didn't even have either. Okay, just so you know. Is worship a struggle? Or is it an overflow of where we've been? You see, what we worship and how we worship will often tell us something about ourselves. The second thing about worship as our priority is that it becomes our most natural response. It's the normalist response that we can have to who God is and all that he has done. When we fully begin to realize what Jesus has achieved, and, you know, we really kind of honed into that this morning, didn't we, as we worshiped together, that Jesus is the one who sets us free. He's the one who brings transformation. He's the one who brings life. When we truly focus in on that, when we see how he's the one who's given us access to the Father's presence, that we can be in relationship with him, our natural response is one of surrender and worship. When we realize all that he has done. And we realize that he's done that even when we were in rebellion to him. He's done that despite our position in the first place. 1 John 4:19, it sums it up like this. It says, we love because he first loved us. We respond to his love because he loved us first and he gave himself up for us. And then lastly, as a way of introduction to the priority of worship, we are made by God to be worshippers. We're made to be worshippers. 1 Peter 2:9 says, he has called us to declare the praises of him who has called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. The Westminster Confession of Faith famously says the chief end of man is to worship God and enjoy him, to glorify him forever. We're all made with an ability to worship. And we all know how to worship. It's in all of us, whether we fully realize it or not. We all know how to make certain things the center of our attention. We all know how to ascribe worth to different things. We all know how to be obsessed about certain things. And if our worship isn't directed towards God, the reality is our worship will be directed somewhere. We are all worshippers of something. A chap called Don Williams, who wasn't a country and western singer, I'm told, but he was a theologian, kind of connected to the Vineyard family of churches. But he said this in his book, The 12 Steps with Jesus. He talks about our ability to worship in relation to this the subject of addiction. Okay. And he says this: addiction is nothing other than being lured into worshipping something or someone other than the living God. Addiction happens when we attach our desire to something or someone or something that controls us. As that attachment grows, it consumes us. Little by little, we become captive to the very thing that gives us pleasure and meaning. So all of us in this room, whether we would call ourselves a Christian or not, are worshippers. We all worship something. We all give ourselves to different things. All of us know how to submit and surrender to different things, to attach ourselves to different things, to someone or something. And as worshippers, we inevitably become like the thing that we worship. We become like the thing that we worship. He goes on to say this. He says, worship money and you'll become a greedy person. Worship sex and you'll become a lustful person. Worship power and you'll become a corrupt person. Worship Jesus and you'll become a Christ-like person. You see, the goal of following Jesus isn't simply to get our ticket stamped so we get to go to heaven when we die. The goal isn't for you to just be a nicer person or to somehow improve your relational skills, to improve your marriage, to make sure you have a better job. The goal of following Jesus is a conversion of our object of worship. That we would give our worship, we would rightly subscribe our ability to worship to the right thing. So instead of worshiping money, instead of worshiping lust or our career or our sexuality, following Jesus, becoming a Christian means we become a worshipper of Christ. We become a worshipper of him. It means no other person, no other pursuit, no other obsession is to come before being a worshipper of him. We're not called to submit, surrender, attach ourselves to anything else other than him. One former Archbishop, William Temple, he said this. He says, worship is the submission of all our nature to God. It is to quicken the conscience by the holiness of God, to find the mind with the truth, to fill the mind with the truth of God, to purge the imagination with the beauty of God, to open the heart to the love of God, and to devote the will to the purpose of God. So if you've got a Bible, why don't you turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 6. If you haven't got a Bible, the words will be up on the screen. And I'm just going to start by reading the first 5 verses. There's a few strange names in this section of the scriptures, and I guarantee I will butcher them. But let's read this together. It says, David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah to Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is throned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, son of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it. And Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all the Israelites were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, tambourines, rattles, and cymbals. Sounds delightful. Just to kind of give us a bit of context to this passage, King David has captured Jerusalem from the Canaanites, and Jerusalem has been made the nation's capital. So it becomes the capital city of Israel. And not only is it going to be the central place of governance, but King David also wants to make it the central place of the worship of God. And so he orders for the ark of God to be transported from the house of Abinadab to Jerusalem. The ark of God, or the ark of the covenant, was a wooden box covered in gold. Inside and out. It was about 1 meter long and about 70 centimeters wide and high. And inside the ark were various artifacts. There were the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. There was Aaron's rod, and there was some manna, the bread that God miraculously fed the Israelites with in the wilderness. And then on the lid of the ark were two angels or two cherubims that were facing downwards, probably to avoid looking towards God, whose presence was believed to reside above the ark. Now, every single one of those objects in the ark point towards something. It points us ultimately towards Jesus. Now, the expectation in our worship is always God's presence, isn't it? We expect that when we come corporately together and we worship God together, we are expectant of his presence. But the reality is that we're not just coming here on a very hot summer's day to sing some nice songs. We're not just here to kind of have a nice, kind of group karaoke session, as the words appear on the screen. Our desire as we worship together is to encounter God and to encounter his presence. That we believe there's something of God's presence that is invoked, that responds to our worship, that Jesus himself is amongst us as we worship. And so these objects inside the ark point us towards the presence of Jesus. The Ten Commandments, the stone tablets given to Moses that summarized God's law, revealing the standard of God set that no one could keep. God laid out this law and no one could keep this. And the only person to perfectly obey God's commands was Jesus. And because of his obedience, even to the point of death, you and I can now enter into his presence as we trust him for our life and salvation. And so those Ten Commandments point us towards the law of God that was fulfilled through Jesus. And then we have Aaron's rod. God called Aaron and his descendants as high priests. And God took his shepherd's staff, this wooden rod, a dead stick, and he infused it with life. And it blossomed almonds, of all things. It blossomed almonds. And again, this rod, it points to Jesus, who became a dead stick for our sin, and who was suddenly infused with life. Aaron's rod offers us a picture of the resurrection of Christ, that he's the one who's come to bring life and life in all its fullness. And then we have the manna. Manna being the thing that sustained God's people in the wilderness. And Jesus himself identifies himself with this manna. In John 6:35, he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. And whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Jesus is our sustainer. He is our bread from heaven. And we all need the presence of Jesus in our lives to nourish us and to sustain us. That's why we so often in our gatherings pray, come, Holy Spirit. It's not because we don't believe he's already here, but we just want to invite his presence again, acknowledge his presence again, that he would come and be amongst us. That a life of worship is a life that hungers and is sustained by God himself. So all these objects in the ark communicate something about the presence of Jesus in our lives and what our worship is to invoke. That our worship invokes God's presence. Now we don't worship to get God's presence. It's almost like worship becomes the byproduct of that is his presence. It's like as we surrender ourselves to God, as we give ourselves to him, He doesn't have to do anything. He's God, okay? He doesn't have to do it, but it's like he can't resist. That as we surrender ourselves to him, he just thinks, oh, my children, they're surrendered to me. They're longing after me. Of course I want to respond. Because I want to be near them. Because I want to pour my presence upon them. And that's what we experience as we worship, don't we? That God just longs to draw near to us. But we don't do it for that reason. But we get the benefits of that as we worship. So all these objects point towards worship. We also see our worship an expectation that involves celebration. It involves celebration. Verse 5 of chapter 6, David and all the Israelites were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. There's this picture of celebration taking place. That when we gather, there's something that should characterize our worship as celebration. Celebration in God's presence. Now, celebration isn't just about a tempo. Okay, when I was a teenager, I often say I did some time in a Pentecostal church. It wasn't like prison at all. It's just I did some time in a Pentecostal church. And sometimes in that kind of church environment, it was like, it felt like sometimes the goal was to just be enthusiastic. Yeah? I don't know if you've ever kind of been in church environments like that, where it's just like, if we can just make people enthusiastic, then that wins. And I'm not sure that that's fully what we mean by celebration. And so celebration isn't just about a tempo or how fast I clap my hands or anything like that. Celebration is about our passion. What are we passionate for? As we sing, we can sing the most jubilant songs without passion, can't we? We can clap our hands, we can jump around, and still on the inside of us, passion is dormant. And you might say, Steve, you know what? It's hard for me to be passionate right now. I've had a tough week. You don't know what kind of week I've had. I've gone through, just a really hard time at work, and there's some challenges that I'm facing right now. Life isn't great. Steve, you should just be grateful that I dragged myself to church this morning. If you heard my story, then you would know why I couldn't celebrate. You would know why I would struggle to celebrate right now. The circumstances I've got are just awful. Yet, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 6, he says this. He says, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. Poor, yet making many rich. Having nothing, yet possessing everything. I think it's possible for us to, as people learning to become worshippers of God, to be in a place of rejoicing even when we're sorrowful, even when we're grieving, even when we feel pain. The picture in the New Testament is of God celebrating not because their circumstances are good, but actually celebrating in the midst of hardship. We see it, don't we? They worship in prison. I don't know if I could do that. They worshipped in prison. They worshipped after being beaten. They worshipped in extreme difficulty. And I think it's because their faith looked beyond their circumstances and looked to the life that Christ offers. Looks to the life that he offers. And so maybe you're here today and you have had a terrible week. Maybe your circumstances are just awful. Maybe you can't right now celebrate victories in certain areas of your life, in your finances, your health, in your relationships. But what might those circumstances look like if you were to view them through what Christ has accomplished? through what Jesus has done. You see, by faith, we're overcoming our circumstances, aren't we? By faith, we're overcoming our addictions. By faith, we're overcoming our defeats. By faith, I can come to worship with celebration and passion in my heart, just like we sang this morning. It's possible to celebrate and not be controlled by our circumstances by placing our hope in Jesus, by placing our hope in him. And so our expectation for worship is one of celebration that's driven by an internal passion, not by an outward performance. But in the midst of celebration, we read this in 2 Samuel 6 and 6 and 7. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burnt against Uzzah because it was an irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down and he died there beside the ark of God. Suddenly, in this kind of narrative, the mood changes. Okay? There they are, they're transporting the ark to Jerusalem, and then suddenly things change. And actually, on the surface, as we read this, that feels quite jarring, doesn't it? It feels quite disturbing that we went from like presence of God, celebration, passion, death. It feels quite disturbing. And so it's helpful to understand a few different things of what's going on to try and get our heads around what might be happening here. Firstly, God had specifically commanded the way the Ark of the Covenant was to be transported. He said to the priest that he didn't want the Ark to be transported on a cart. See something going wrong here? He didn't want the ark to be transported on a cart, but he wanted it to be carried on poles. And in fact, the ark had these rings along the side where poles would have been slipped through, and the idea was that they would carry the ark on their shoulders. And he also said no one was to touch the ark or go near it except one day of the year on the Day of Atonement. And that would only be the high priest who would have a sacrifice on behalf of the people. So that's the first thing that we know. You know, there's a few things gone wrong there already. Second thing, it's helpful to know who Uzzah was. Uzzah was the son of Abinadab, and he grew up in a home where the ark was kept. Uzzah saw the ark of God every day growing up, or at least I guess he did. And what, in some ways, what an amazing privilege to be a child growing up in a home where you crawled around on the floor and there behind the curtain is the ark of God. But I also think this is where Uzzah's problem is as well. Because I think Uzzah became overly familiar with God. In some ways, for Uzzah, this golden box on the back of a cart was like, oh yeah, it's the ark. You know, that box that's been in our house for years. And maybe Uzzah is a picture of many of us, especially those of us who would be maybe like second or third generation Christians. What I mean is like those of us who have been brought up in church. And if that's true, you know, those of us who have been brought up in church, we kind of know, don't we, how to do the right things. Yeah, we know how to do the right things. Maybe, like me, you went to Sunday school, and you primarily went because you knew you were going to get sweets. That was one of my reasons, and my parents made me, of course. But in Sunday school, I remember praying the prayer of salvation like every week, just to make sure it worked. You know, that was one thing. And, you know, we sang songs and, I won't harm you with some of those songs that I can still sing now. But we sang songs over and over again. We knew how to raise our hands at the right times, in the right places. And could it be that because we are so familiar with what it means to be in church and what it means to be a worshipper, that it becomes routine rather than an act of obedience? That our worship becomes this kind of routine, like, oh yeah, this is the bit where I close my eyes, this is the bit where I raise my hands, and this is where the bit where I kind of, hold the telly, all those different worship styles that people have. But we become really, really over familiar. And as a teenager, I recognized that in my life. That was exactly my experience. I knew how to do all the right things. I'd been part of different things, experienced different things in my life, but that didn't necessarily equal my obedience. And surely obedience didn't matter. That actually my over-familiarity with God resulted in me having this God that will love me no matter what kind of mentality. And so I think, and I could be wrong here, okay? I could be reading way too much into this passage. But I believe Uzzah's problem wasn't that he touched the ark to stop it from falling over. But it was his over-familiarity with God and his lack of obedience to what God had commanded them to do in the first place. And so it's important for us, as we think about being a people who worship God, to see this tension between our celebration and jubilance and passion in one hand and our call to obedience in the other. You see, in the midst of celebration and enjoying our time with God, it's easy to become over familiar with God, to become fast and loose with what his commands are. Where God becomes the Almighty instead of the Almighty. We begin to justify ourselves. Well, God won't mind if I do this. We've had this enjoyable time. That command to put the ark on a cart, surely that isn't that important. It would be much easier if we could just stick this on a car and get the ox to tow it along. I've done my back in. I can't carry the ark myself. And so we tell ourselves that God won't mind. We convince ourselves that it's okay. And then we think, well, surely it's okay because, God uses me. We were talking about this earlier, that, sometimes, God will use people who are deeply flawed. Have you ever seen that? And you think, oh my goodness, what's happened? How is that so? But the reality is that we often mistake our spiritual impact for a life surrendered to God. And those things seem to sometimes be detached from one another, which I really don't get. I'm just like, God, I don't understand that. And Jesus warns us about this, doesn't he? In Matthew 7:21, and we're coming into land. He says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of the Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoer. And so there's this stark warning, isn't there, that we can become over familiar with God. We can become fast and loose with the way in which we do things. We can treat God like our our mate and forget that he's the Almighty God. And we can totally miss our call to obedience. Our call to reverently surrender ourselves to him and be obedient to him. And so worship is not just about our enjoyment of God's presence. Worship is not just about our celebration and passion and feeling good. It also involves wholehearted obedience to God, where we invite God to put his finger on areas of disobedience in our lives and make us wholeheartedly his. Where we invite him to knock down the idols in our lives and convert us wholly to become worshippers of him. You see, our worship has to get past the show, has to get past the hype, and it has to become about simple, authentic obedience to him. And the truth is, in a moment like this, we can do one of two things, can't we? We can run. We can run. And I know for me, for a number of years, it felt easier to run. Easier to run than deal with the areas of my life that I knew needed to line up with God. And maybe you're here this morning and you know you're running. And you've been running. And God has put his finger on an area of your life where he's calling you back into obedience with him. But right now, it just feels like it's easier to run. It's easier to run away. But the other option is to simply fall on his mercy and ask him to bring us back into obedience with him. Let's not let our over-familiarity to desensitize our heart to what God wants to do. Remember what we said at the start. Worship forms and informs every activity of our lives. Worship is our lifestyle. It's who we're called to be. Our worship is meant to be a priority. We're to live a lifestyle of worship, and our expectation is that worship always will involve his presence. His presence. And as men and women surrender to him, we expect and to experience and encounter his presence. And it's in that place of encounter that we find that place of true celebration, true passion and gratitude and thanks for all that God has done. It's our natural response. It's how we respond to him. But let's remember the holiness of the one we're called to worship. We're called to worship a holy God. And let's be the kind of people where our worship is expressed through lives that are obedient to him. That you and I would be men and women who are obedient to him. That would be our first calling. Whatever you say, Lord, we want to be obedient to you. So why don't we quickly stand if you can, and we'll just quickly pray.